this part is basically about the killer's childhood and just getting into like more of like their psyche and how they grew up and things before we go into like the horrific events that happened later on. You guys probably all know about this. We're going to be talking about the Moors murderers, which are quite notoriously known. Loads of people have done like videos on them, so let's get into it anyway without further ado. So this one was Ian Brady, truly born evil. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into the serial killer's childhood. So the young couple unleashed a wave of terror and panic across the greater Manchester area over a 2-year span when 4 children suddenly vanished without a trace, only ceasing when their 5th murder was reported to police by a witness in October 1965. Though by victim count, Brady and Hindley were nowhere near as prolific as the likes of Harold Shipman, Dennis Nielsen, the Wests, or Peter Sutcliffe. The details of their sheer brutality and perversion of their crimes against children have never been forgotten. The foreboding backdrop of Saddleworth Moor, the abolition of the death penalty prior to the couple's trial, and the closing comments by the trial judge that described Brady and Hindley as 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity, helped condemn the couple into infamy. Hindley in particular received a particular interest from newspapers, owing in part to her infamous glaring mugshot and in part to the sheer disbelief surrounding how a woman could be complicit in the SA and murders of children, no less a woman who seemed normal to her friends and family. Her subsequent campaign for parole earned her the unofficial title of the most evil woman in Britain and led to even further condemnation by journalists, politicians, the general public and the families of her and Brady's victims. Yet even at this time it was still universally understood that Brady was the instigator of the murders. Most experienced commentators on the case agreed that even though Brady and Hindley were equally responsible for the horrors they inflicted upon so many families, it was Brady himself who took the most direct satisfaction from sexually torturing and murdering children, whereas Hindley's satisfaction seemed to lie in large part in seeing Brady sexually fulfilled. I explored the dynamic between Brady and Hindley in another article, which also pieced together their accounts of how it was that they came to murder children, but I steered clear of discussing their respective early lives in too great detail in that particular article. It is easy to write off individuals like Brady and Hindley as monsters, yet what such labels fail to acknowledge is that the couple were in fact 2 incredibly calculated people who blended in with their surroundings, insidiously abused their human qualities and relatability to lure in their unsuspecting young victims, and then once their horrific and monstrous crimes were completed, they proceeded to live very ordinary lives before rinsing and repeating the cycle in a few months' time. In fact, Brady himself perceived the crimes as him and Hindley simply acting on their innermost desires as humans, which he saw as suppressed through socialization and the confines of a regime founded upon false principles of law and order. When discussing what shapes the decisions of serial killers, FBI profiler Jim Clemente is often paraphrased in true crime extensive and documented details surrounding Brady's and Hindley's crimes and Hindley's own childhood. There is comparatively little information surrounding the earlier life of Ian Brady, though some of his reasoning for this is due to the relative banality of his early life, which of it is arguably his own later doing. Reflecting upon his childhood from behind bars, Brady frequently claimed that other people's negative memories and perceptions of him were either false or exaggerated before giving his own, usually positive, detailed accounts in place. There's nothing positive about abuse. You can't sugarcoat so horrific shit and just be like, oh look at it, it's so positive. Some things are just so disgusting and below the bar. You cannot put a positive spin on everything, and you shouldn't, because it's then we don't know what's right or wrong. It's just so weird way of thinking. It's so fucked up way of thinking. Another dimension of this is that Brady was a fantasist, so some of his claims, particularly regarding delinquent and sexually aggressive behaviour in his childhood, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Maurice Richardson, who was in the gallery of the courtroom in 1966 in a journalistic capacity on behalf of the Observer newspaper, concluded that Brady had had a hopeless start and probably drew something sinister in the chromosomal lottery. But in Brady's eyes, he was no more morally corrupt than the world and circumstances around him were. He also tended to avoid answering questions about more personal and psychological experiences from his childhood, unless it was something that he could write down in a flowery prose. He laughed off the notions of predestination that one biographer, Emily Williams, put forward in his best-selling but controversial book On the Case Beyond Belief in 1969. From the day of his birth, the spell had been woven, and nothing could have changed him, nothing. He was born at 12:40 p.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of January, 1938, at Rotten Row. That fits the bill. That fits the fucking bill. Maternity Hospital in Glasgow, and christened Ian Duncan Stewart. Margaret Peggy Stewart, who went by the nickname Maggie, during the first few years of her son's life, was the only parent listed on Ian's birth certificate. She was 27 years old, single, and she did not appear to have any close relatives at the time. Young Ian would eventually come to understand that his father was a journalist, but Peggy, for reasons of her own, kept his identity a secret. A widely reported narrative surrounding Brady's childhood is that he was abandoned by his mother. This conjures up the worst of images, but Peggy did not simply drop Ian off on a doorstep or send him into a foster home or adoption centre. She still remained a significant figure in his childhood, even though she floated in and out of it somewhat unpredictably. Regardless, it is important to clarify that Peggy did everything she could to provide for a young son, but as a single working-class mother to an illegitimate child in the 1930s Glasgow, this was going to prove difficult. At the time of her son's birth, Peggy was living with a friend at 8 Huntington Place in St. Rollocks, and was barely getting by as a waitress in the tea room of City Hotel. She just about managed to cling on to a job afterwards, though it did come with a sacrifice, a change to part-time hours in the immediate weeks after Ian's birth, and no available provision of child support or other kinds of benefit payment meant that she had to look for accommodation elsewhere. Peggy eventually found a first-story single room in a tenement on the corner of Crown Street and Kildoni was a rough and particularly violent Glasgow slum. On a lesser wage, Becky struggled to provide herself and Ian with basic necessities such as food and clothing, having no choice but to work at every given opportunity and then use almost all of that money to keep up with rent and extortionate winter energy bills. It is uncertain to what extent Brady was left on his own whilst his mother was working. A later correspondent of Brady's, Colin Wilson, claimed that he was farmed out to various babysitters whilst Becky worked in the evenings. Antonella Gumberberg, author of Apple, Sex, Drugs, Motherhood and the Recovery of the Feminine 2022, writes otherwise, and this assumption forms the basis for a substantial proportion of her book. Carol Ann Lee, author of two acclaimed books on the Morse murders case, claims that Peggy struggled to find someone to care for the baby while she returned to waitressing. In either case, the first few months of Brady's life are clearly an issue that has not been addressed enough from a psychological standpoint. Cam Butterberg discusses the negative impacts of malnutrition on the development of an infant's temporal lobe in some detail. Amongst other functions, the temporal lobe regulates bonding and emotional stability, sexual desire, the ability to identify the emotions of others, and the integration of emotion with perception. Peggy soon acknowledged that she couldn't return to working full-time, as she would end up neglecting her son altogether, but there was also no way that she was going to put him in an orphanage. The only option she had left was to seek alternative care for her baby. When Ian was a few months old, Peggy put a note in a newspaper's window offering to give £1 per week to anyone willing and suitable to look after her baby on a full-time basis. On a wage of less than £3 per week, this was yet another huge sacrifice for Peggy. It is unknown how many people responded to her advertisement, but Peggy would later maintain to Ian that she chose it with care. She chose a friend of hers, Mrs. Mary Sloane, who lived nearby at 56 Camden Street. Brady would go on to spend virtually his entire childhood living with the Sloane family, and by all accounts he treated him as one of their own. Mary and her husband John were approaching middle age. John, who would pass away in 1962, a year before Brady and Hindley's first murder, worked as a grain mill worker at a nearby firm named Motherwell's, while Mary was a full-time housewife. At this point, they had 3 children of their own, with the 4th being born 4 years later in 1942. The brownstone tenements of Camden Street were no different than the sordid single room that Peggy was living in. The tenements were 3 stories high, each level consisting of 3 rentable apartments and a shared toilet. The Sloanes occupied a 2-room apartment on the first floor. Though the family were clearly not particularly well off themselves, after all they were living in one of the poorest slums in Scotland, they were more than happy to help Peggy out in her desperation and foster her son into a traditional home, and when the child was not too much of a financial strain, Peggy would come to 56 Camden Street whenever she could, making a firm commitment to visit her son at least every Sunday. Even though later in his life Brady said that he always knew he wasn't one of their siblings, and even though he found out from an early age that Peggy was his real mother, he had told a psychiatrist who examined him prior to his 1966 trial that he was 13 years old when he learned he was illegitimate. This cast some doubt on both of those claims, and even though he had said that learning about this left him feeling resentful, he later stated that the dichotomy, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, dichotomy, between parents was not pivotal. I was aware of it from an early age, searching for fashionable, stereotypical excuses and scapegoats efforts in childhood would be fruitless in my case. As this article progresses, it would become even more clear that Brady would usually reflect on his own childhood with nostalgia and glee, in spite of other accounts that dispute him and even some of his own contradictions. Nevertheless, from what little we know for certain, his life was content with the Sloane family, and he unofficially adopted their surname. The neighbourhood boys would even nickname him Sloaney. Having moved back to working full-time, Becky paid for Ian's clothes and upkeep and enjoyed spoiling him with the gifts whenever she could afford it too. She brought him a frilly silk shirt, a kilt for Sundays, and black velvet trousers that he would wear during the week, unique for a corporal's lad. The neighbours agreed, and at 5 or 6 years old he was considered the smartest wee lad in the street. But some remember that he was also clearly troubled even at this young age. On the 1st of September 1939, Adolf Hitler's forces invaded Poland. Brady was not even 2 years old at this point, and as a naturally curious child, the devastation of the ensuing global war was always going to be a challenge for him to come to terms with during his early years. Over 1,200 civilians across Glasgow's metropolitan area were killed over the course of 2 nights during the Clydesdale Blitz of March 1941, and the city itself suffered through a total of 11 air raids over the course of the war. According to Brady, his foster brother was serving on an HMS destroyer ship, and many of Ian's own future classmates also had relatives who had been drafted abroad to fight the Nazis. To all of my age, it was an exciting time, not one of fear or danger, he would eventually recall. The blackout was also hilarious. With families bumping into one another and tripping over cats as they negotiated the streets and alleys to reach cinemas. It's got such a weird sense of humour. It's not even a sense of humour though. And as air raid sirens sounded, sprinting from apartments to the relative safety of the tenement store steps always became somewhat of a routine for the residents of Camden Street. Brady would vividly detail one instance where a parachute bomb decimated the church at the end of the street, leaving the building on either side completely untouched. By all accounts, Brady's home life was as comfortable as it could have been during wartime. The Sloanes had the rare luxury of a piano in their front room, which Brady learned to play by ear. He was a huge fan of the cinema and also enjoyed the mix Hotspur, Rover, Adventure, Beano and Dandy. Ma Sloane allowed him to play in the communal backyard after her supervision, although the rubble left behind from Luftwaffe bombing likely did nothing but exacerbate the already toxic crime of the city suburbs. Brady began his education at Camden Street Infant School in 1943. He claimed that he had already learned to read by this point thanks to his beloved comics, and he graduated into the primary section a few months later. According to his peers, a troubling duality was already emerging. Brady was reportedly nicknamed Big Lassie by the neighbourhood boys due to his poor football playing skills. Persistent reports also suggested that Brady, from a very young age, threw temper tantrums that often culminated in repeated and violent headbanging. If this was true, it might have resulted in further emotional development stunting, which, as we know, because a lot of some people, some serial killers and murderers, psychology could potentially be an indicator of a psychopathic personality. To a later correspondent, religious studies professor Dr. Alan Knightley, Brady discussed the trauma that would have been experienced by another mother who tried to bring up a child without a father in the 1940s, though he did not reference his own experience directly. Brady also believed that years of only referring to his real mother as Peggy created a psychological barrier between the two of them that was only ever come when she stayed loyal to him during his eventual imprisonment. Most biographers in the case maintain that Brady was a lonely child, a lanky outsider who would never join in on team games like football. Brady even admitted to a psychiatrist prior to his trial that he had difficulty making friends as a child due to his introversion, but decades later he wrote that, "In my childhood years, I was not the stereotypical loner so beloved by the popular media. Friends formed around me eagerly in the school playground listening to me talk, and I took it as natural. Apparently, I had a descriptive talent and contagious enthusiasm." Modern studies have since revealed that antisocial behaviours such as those associated with psychopathy and sociopathy typically have their onset before the age of 8 years old, and that boys develop symptoms earlier than girls. From the moment the case became headline news, there have been tales of a young Ian Brady throwing cats out of the windows, beheading them, stoning them, burning them, impaling them on spiked railings, starving them, and burying them alive. He would reportedly carry a flick knife around with him and use it to taunt or cut down any neighbourhood cat that was unfortunate enough to cross his violent path. As for the fate of other animals, various reports have stated that he sliced open caterpillars with razor blades, pulled wings off of flies. I hate this bit. I don't want to say it because I have rabbits, but decapitated rabbits, broke one dog's leg and set another on fire, killed birds and crucified frogs. So yeah, a bastard, a fucking evil. Anyone who can hurt an animal, evil in my book, evil, because I love animals so much. They're just the most loving creatures, and I just go on. To the journalist Fred Harrison in 1985, Brady admitted to throwing cats out the window and things like that. Everybody did it in the Gorbals, but he would later backtrack and deny abusing any animal. Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping, the police chief who reopened the Morse Murders case in the 1980s, noted that Brady was always upset if he read about cruelty to animals, and he did not like the articles and books that claimed he had been cruel to a cat when he was a child. In his later years, Brady would tell numerous anecdotes with the aim of communicating how empathetic and sympathetic he claimed he was towards animals. One story he often recalled concerned how he was traumatized by the sight of an injured horse on an icy road. He witnessed the construction of a canvas screen surrounding the injured horse, prompting him to flee, fully aware that the horse was about to be shot out of its suffering. But the rumoured early penchant for sadism did not just extend to animals. Apparently the young Ian Brady inflicted his wrath on other neighbourhood children as well. John Dean Potter, the author of the first book on this case, The Monsters of the Moors, 1966, asserted that he used to torment a disabled child who once tied a boy and girl to a lamppost and left them there. Another early biographer on the case, Judge Gerald Sparrow, reported that if a playmate was weaker than he was, it was not very long before he or she was being either bruised, cut or burned by Ian Brady. One of the most infamous tales from this period of Brady's childhood was told by John Cameron, an old playmate who lived on the ground floor of the Camden Street however, is the fact that dangerous street games were frequent in the Gorbals. One such game was called Catching a Poachers, which proved deadly on several occasions. Essentially, the game involved waiting for a truck or van to pass, then leaping onto its back, grasping onto anything available for sport. Brady mentioned that he knew Billy Wallace, a boy who died while playing the game, but his death didn't deter him or the other local children from participating. Brady would also recall that one time he and his friends were standing on a street corner waiting to catch a orgy when one boy in the group jumped onto the back of a passing truck. He was unable to hold on and fell off, rolling underneath a truck filled with crates and empty bottles. A crowd of adults gathered around the scene, and Brady ended up seeing nothing but a small brown shoe filled to the brim with blood. Though both the Sloanes and Peggy attempted to raise Ian as a Christian, he was decidedly agnostic from an early age. During a religious instruction lesson, the teacher apparently asked the class if anybody there didn't believe in God, and only Ian's arm was raised. In the summer of 1946, when Brady was 8 years old, the Sloane family went on vacation to Loch Lomond. This was his first documented experience of the great outdoors, and he would later return to the lochs as an adult and take a boat trip with Myra Hindley. He considered this first visit a transcendental experience. I was shattered by the sense of vastness. It was as though I had suddenly stepped through an invisible barrier and had arrived in a different dimension. This was the first of several spiritual awakenings he claimed to experience in outdoor settings, which later included Saddleworth Moor. Throughout his life, he said that he found himself inexplicably drawn to natural substances such as stone and rock, and that as an adult he would often travel back from Manchester to the Gorbals to touch the stone tenements near where he grew up. In 1947, the Sloane family, along with hundreds of other families in the Gorbals district, were resettled onto the Pollock-Eversville estate as part of Glasgow's post-war slum clearance scheme. The council allocated them a semi-detached 3-bedroom home on Temple Land Road, a significant improvement from their previous home on 56 Camden Street. It did both front and back gardens as well as an indoor bathroom. Brady secured a provisional spot at the House Hillwood School to pursue his primary education, subsequently transitioning to Carl Wadrick School, where he commuted daily by bus. The Sloanes were fortunate to be among the first families to secure a house in Pollock during its construction. Much of the inland was still a wide open space with trees to climb and the safely shallow white-cart water to play in. It was a perfect opportunity for young Brady and his peers to put the stresses of life behind them. He eagerly helped the Sloane out in the garden, and he even built a rabbit hutch. He soon acquired 3 rabbits, and Ma and Dar Sloane brought Brady's foster sister a cocker spaniel that she named Sheila. Brady also doted on the dog dearly and was distraught when she died less than a year later, claiming that this was the night he turned his back on religion for God. The only real drawback to the move was that Brady's former friends now lived 6 miles away from him. He would catch the bus back there as often as possible to meet up with them. He claimed to have also regularly visited Peggy back in the Gorbals, though the visits gradually became fewer and further between once she started dating Pat Brady, an Irish ex-army man who is now working as a labourer. When Pat took a job opportunity in Manchester, Peggy followed him, and the two married on the 16th of May 1950 at the All Saints Registry Office. Though communication between Ian and Peggy was now entirely through letters, they supposedly never lost touch, although it would be 4 years before he would adopt his new stepfather's surname. Around the age of 11, Brady reached puberty and claimed to have started dating girls. He said that he discovered that he most enjoyed kissing when he was drawing blood. This was even carried on into his eventual relationship with his future co-defendant Myra Hindley. His most significant relationship was with a girl named Evelyn. Although the two were casual, he considered her to be very much his type. Honey blonde hair, high cheekbones and grey or almond-shaped eyes that he saw a fierce glint in. Once during some horseplay, I gave her a bite as a barbaric token. Brady and Evelyn would both achieve top grades in their qualifying, the Scottish equivalent of the 11+ exams of the time, and the two of them graduated from the relatively prestigious Shawlands Academy. During this time, the school's community was embarking on a cultural reckoning due to the construction of the Pollock estate, as well as several other overspill estates around the city that would soon emerge throughout the ensuing decade. A historic school with a reputation for serving Glasgow's middle class, Shawlands was now seeing an influx of high-achieving students from nearby council estates, including Brady, and a new wing had been built next to the old building to adapt to the surge of new students. The school's ethos of formality and structure remained, but this did little to steer Brady, who was lacking in ambition and already questioning the notions of morality and established order, away from the path of juvenile delinquency. Whether the integrated environment of his new school was a significant culture shock to Brady is unknown, though he did later speak of a particular materialism, or rather an attachment to material objects that he could trace back to his time at Shawlands. I began more and more to invest in inanimate objects with personality and sentience, perhaps because they did charge as people do and were more reliable. This was an attachment that only helps to illustrate how he became to perceive human life as comparatively fragile, but it was also one that would eventually crystallize into his adulthood passion for photography, whether it be of a romantic boat trip at Loch Lomond with Myra Hindley, or to help them mark the nearby grave of a murdered child on Saddleworth Moor. There were more troubling indications arising at this time in Brady's childhood. Shawlands had a large Jewish population at the time, and while there are no written accounts of Ian ever subjecting his Jewish peers to anti-Semitic bullying or violence, some of his classmates started noticing his fondness for Nazi Germany. Some biographers have stated that Brady's interest dates back even further, and that he collected Nazi souvenirs around the age of 9. A former Shawlands classmate, Frank Fraser, commented, "He read all kinds of books about the Nazis and never stopped talking about them. Even when we were playing war games, he made a great point of being a German. My brother was stationed in Germany, and Ian was always badgering him for Nazi souvenirs. When Ian used to shout, 'Segel,' I don't know if I've pronounced that, I've probably not said it right, I don't know, and give the Nazi salute, people would laugh." The author Gerald Sparrow wrote, "What appeared to appeal to him, Brady, in the Hitler regime was the cruelty of the racial philosophy directed against races other than the purely Aryan. The beating up of those who opposed the Hitler regime gave him immense pleasure, and as a logical sequence to this kind of thinking, the comparatively compassionate welfare state philosophy that privileged in England moved him his trips to the countryside with the Sloanes gave him an enormous feeling of elation to be surrounded by such a vast expanse of green. He did manage to piece it together to an extent in his later life, though. He told Dr. Knightley that his particular awakening did not happen in the countryside, but it happened as he was riding his bike on the way home from a job interview. I felt a strange change coming over me. My body felt light and I felt a little dizzy. My bicycle appeared to be moving with the will of its own. I was being enveloped by some kind of bright radiance. The buildings, vehicles and people around me seemed not to belong to my world anymore. I felt removed from them. I had never experienced anything like this before, but I succumbed to it and became completely passive about what was about to happen to me. I managed to stop the bike on its own course at the corner of Paisley Road, slumped against a newsagent shop window, and then moved into the dry shelter of the shop's entrance. It was dim in these early stages, then it slowly grew more intense. There was a green radiation, beautiful and warm, making what Charles Dickens would describe as mere phantoms of passing individuals, and the road traffic making both insignificant. I entered willingly into the green manifestation, immersing my whole being in the swirling warm cloud. There was something wrong within it, as yet indistinct, seen in the brief glimpses through the green mist as a more substantial fluctuating formation. Sounds were coming from its centre, as though from a great distance or depth, hollow and not yet identifiable as a familiar language. Features formed slowly in the shimmering green radiance. Was it male, female, or hermaphroditic? They were sounds rather than words. Were they coming from my subconscious? And then came the realization I was in the presence of death itself. I was witnessing it and hearing its sounds. Despite what he would later claim, early biographies on the case paint a narrative that, to his peers at Shawlands, Brady seemed to be somewhat of an oddball. He had grown tall and gangly, with his hair that always needed trimming. He avoided school clubs and social events, and he didn't take part in any sports. As previously mentioned, people perceived him as somewhat of a lone lull with few friends and no involvement in playground fights. Aside from that, he was also known to be a horror movie fanatic and a Dracula and Mr. Hyde painted on his school bag. He eventually came to be nicknamed Dracula, which he likely much preferred to Big Lassie. At Shawlands, Brady was clearly losing interest in his studies and was displaying increasingly antisocial behaviour. Perhaps this coincided with his realizations of his confirmation that he was illegitimate. Though he wasn't known to be involved in gang crime among any of his classmates, he was said to pester the same boy he painted his school bag for drawings and paintings of infamous gangsters such as Al Capone and John Dillinger. Aside from his classmates' recollections, Brady said that by now he was living a double life between Pollock and the Corbels. The only shared activity between both groups was breaking and entering. Brady claimed he had first done this when he was 9 years old. For the thrill of it, however, he and his new friends in the Pollock gang were apparently in it mostly for the cash. He claimed that at one point he and the Pollock gang were committing up to 3 breakings per evening. Brady spent most of his share on his profits of gifts for Evelyn, although she had no clue where the extra money was coming from. His neighbours were noticing that he had more money than most, and Marslow was becoming concerned that he was staying out so late in the evenings. Brady stated that the only signs of family dispute at this time emerged with his foster parents. Insisted he join the boys' brigade or the Scouts, and he refused. He did agree to attend Sunday school, but attended only for the first week and played tennis every other time he left the house. Although the Sloanes never knew about this, it wouldn't be long before they found out about his evening activities. He and the Pollock gang appeared before Glasgow's juvenile courts on the 5th of May 1951 on charges of housebreaking and attempted theft after a fellow pupil resumed their burglaries, this time a little further away in an area known as Corker Hill. In the final weeks of summer of that year, Peggy apparently invited Brady down to Manchester for a fortnight's holiday, where he met his new stepfather and explored the city, as well as venturing out to the Mark in Ashton under Lane with Peggy. Glasgow Govan Court the Pollock gang on new charges of housebreaking and theft on the 16th of July 1952. Their latest recruit stolen a crafted cutthroat razor in one of their burglaries, and after the boy's father found it hidden under the cushion of a chair in his bedroom, he made his son go to the police and confess everything. Brady was implicated as ringleader, convicted of theft of money and admonished. Brady would later claim that he never got the chance to enact his revenge on that boy. Brady left the school the following year with no significant qualifications, no professional ambitions, and with Evelyn no longer by his side. The straw that broke the camel's back is unclear, but if it was undoubtedly due to Brady's actions, and he would later tell Dr. Knightley that he was ashamed of how he had treated her. Following his Shawlands graduation, Brady took on a few low-paying jobs as a butcher's assistant